Good day. Today, 13th August, we are further into the month of August, the third month of Ukraine's offensive. By my somewhat crude calculations, I'm guessing that we're about 67 days now into this offensive. In other words, it has been going on well beyond the 2-month period, and of course far beyond the 3-week period that some people in the West had apparently anticipated it would take for Ukraine to break through all the way to the Sea of Azov, cutting the Russian land bridge from Russia pre-2014 Russia to Crimea. Anyway, what has happened on the battlefronts over the last 24 hours? The short answer is intense fighting in 3 locations, but with the initiative steadily shifting in the Russians' favour. And I'm going to, in a short time, read a blog piece by Alexander Khodakovsky, the commander of the Vostok unit of the Donbass militia, who, as I said, as well as being an active commander of the battle on the battlefronts, is also, in my opinion, an insightful and interesting commentator. Anyway, what actually did happen? Well, first of all, there were more attacks of the usual sort by Ukraine from Orekhov towards Rabotino. I should say that there have been claims in the past that Ukraine has captured Rabotino. Those claims have been debunked weeks ago, and yet, incredibly, I still find sometimes Western commentators who speak of Rabotino as being under Ukrainian control. But anyway, there was more Ukrainian attacks towards Rabotino yesterday. These attacks failed. There was a further Ukrainian attack towards Rabotino this morning. This attack has also failed. Ukraine is making lots of these attacks towards Rabotino. This appears to have been the point which Ukraine identified as the major place where it needed to break through if it was to push on towards the Sea of Azov. It hasn't happened. It's been stuck trying to capture this one small village, which, to be very clear, is not even part of the Surovikin line. So that's fighting there on the Zaporozhye front. Ukrainian losses in this area have been horrendous, but this is where, as I said, a lot of the fighting, perhaps the most intense fighting, or at least the most intense attacks by Ukraine, have been taking place. And on the Vremevka salient area, there was lots of news yesterday about an intense Ukrainian attack on the village of Urozhainaye. This has been a village that, again, Ukraine has been trying to capture some time now, after the Russians were pushed out of Staromayorsk village, which apparently nobody controls and which is in the grey zone. Defending Urozhainaye became much more difficult for the Russians. There were lots of reports yesterday of a very, very powerful Ukrainian attack of missiles, Ukraine launching missiles, and even guided American JDAMS bombs. These are precision-guided bombs, presumably launched from some Ukrainian aircraft, being used to strike at this village. There was a report at one point that the village was 50-50. Half of it was under Ukrainian control, half of it was under Russian control. There were other reports that the Russians had been pushed out of the village entirely. There were rumours early this morning that Ukraine was going to announce capture of this village, which, of course, they might eventually do. But anyway, as at the time of the making of this video, the reports speak of a Russian counterattack and of the Russians at least attempting to push the Ukrainians back out of various positions that they captured over the course of their attack yesterday. Again, I want to reiterate that Urozhainaya is ahead, it's in front of the Surovikin line. It's not actually exactly a part of it. It would be the capture of a small village. It would be capture of a village, but a deserted village, a ruined village. It's unlikely because it is in ruins. There isn't apparently, again, a single house left standing in this village now. It's a village where it's difficult now for troops to gain cover. If the Russians are pushed out, it's most likely going to be another case like Staromayorsk or Pyatikhatki, which is at the other side of the southern front lines, at the far west, near the Dnieper River. It's going to be another village which will probably fall into the grey zone. I ought to say that over the course of yesterday, as reports of this Ukrainian attack on Urozhainaya circulated, it was again fascinating to read some of the comments on the threads which appeared on the Russian internet from some people, principally, as I noticed, people in the West, Westerners commenting on these threads about how this was proof, this capture, this small village was proof that Ukraine's offensive was now starting to gather pace. These people who seem to show much less interest in events further north, near Kupiansk, which we'll come to shortly, or indeed in the Bakmut area, where things have now started to swing again against Ukraine. My own 2 cents on this is that Urozhainaya is most unlikely its capture by Ukraine, even if they are able to consolidate control of it, is not going to change anything fundamentally on the battlefront, on the battlefields. And if we go somewhat to the east, the northeast, again, heavy fighting in the Bakmut area, but here it looks as if it's the Russians who have now wrested the initiative. They've apparently pushed forward around Kleshevka. They seem to be gaining ground all around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. Ukraine has made intense attempts to capture Kleshevka. They've never fully managed to do it, and it seems that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians significantly back all around Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, and that overall their defences in this area are largely intact. I would add again a point I have made many times, that Bakhmut fell under Russian control on the 20th of May, when the Wagner forces finally cleared the last buildings in Bakhmut of their Ukrainian defenders. The Ukrainian offensive began on the 4th of June. That is a period of just 2 weeks. There was insufficient time during that period for the Russians to consolidate fully their control either of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, or of the neighbouring villages. Ukraine remained in control of Khromovo and Ivaniska. There's some criticisms, by the way, of the Wagner organization that have been circulating, that they pulled out from Bakhmut too quickly, that if they'd been a reliable and disciplined unit, they should have pushed on and at least captured Chromovo and perhaps Ivanivska as well. And indeed, there's been suggestions that they should have pushed even further west until they reached a river and anchored the defense of this area there. But whatever the reason, either the heavy losses that they'd suffered, or Prigozhin's political ambitions, or his abiding resentments of the defense ministry, Prigozhin and Wagner pulled out directly after the capture of Bakhmut, and the result is that a powerful military unit was removed from the battlefronts, and the situation was never fully consolidated, notwithstanding which Ukraine has not succeeded in encircling Artyomovsk or capturing Artyomovsk or driving the Russians out of Artyomovsk or doing any of those sort of things. There's been large numbers of troops have lost their lives in these attacks that Ukraine has launched. A lot of equipment has been destroyed. But so far, the results have been meagre. The one thing that I think Ukraine has achieved in the Bakhmut area is because the Russians haven't had the time to create the elaborate defense systems that they have in other places, even in the zones of control ahead of the Surovikin line. I suspect that in the Bakhmut area, Russian losses have been higher than they have been on other battlefronts. On the topic of Russian losses, I noticed that Mediazona and the BBC have now come up with more figures for Russian fatalities during the war. This is based on obituary notices, funerals, that sort of thing, right across Russia. As I've discussed previously, it's now clear that these losses do include the losses incurred by the Wagner organization, and I've come round to the belief that they also include the Donbass militia as well. And in fact, all of the troops, all the fighters who are part of the Russian war effort. And the BBC Mediazona have now increased their calculations. They've now reached a figure of around 30,000. And this is, it should be stressed, is fatalities. These are dead people. I previously said that I think that the methodology used by this study is sound. The BBC and Mediazona continue to insist that there are probably very large numbers of fatalities that they've missed. I've never understood quite why they think that. I think that 30,000 fatalities is probably about right, given the way in which the war has been fought. Now, I would make one observation, incidentally, which is that Mediazona and the BBC are exclusively focused in this study on Russian fatalities. They have not conducted any comparable research on Ukrainian fatalities. Well, in Mediazona's case, perhaps one wouldn't expect that. But in the case of the BBC, I think it might actually be helpful and would give people in Britain and people who watch and follow the BBC a better sense of the overall war if they partnered with another NGO or group comparable to Mediazona that applied the same kind of methodology to establishing numbers of deaths in Ukraine. Because 30,000 dead Russians. We understand where the war is going. We would really need to know, it seems to me, what Ukrainian casualties are. And it is a major omission, and in my opinion, a incomprehensible omission by the BBC that they're not doing that. And whilst I would reiterate again, I think the methodology used in this study is sound, without getting a comparable figure, a comparably calculated figure for Ukrainian losses, the understanding of the course of the war is being severely distorted. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. I think that probably Russian losses, as I said, in the Bakhmut area, have been significantly higher than they are in other parts of the battlefronts. I would guess that the ratio of dead Ukrainians to Russians in the battle in the Ukrainian area, in the Bakhmut area, perhaps is closer to, say, 3-1 than the 7-1 that the Russians are claiming in other places. That's just, these are guesses. I might be wrong on this. But we're never given fully precise figures by any Western source about, or at least even calculated figures from any Western source about Ukrainian losses. And that is a massive, huge omission in our understanding of this war. Now, the Ukrainian losses are on a huge scale is hardly disputed any longer. And I noticed that The Economist magazine is now saying that so many Ukrainian soldiers are dying that Ukraine is now obliged to exhume the bodies of soldiers killed in earlier wars, by which of course they mean the Second World War, in order to find space in the cemeteries for the Ukrainian soldiers who are dying in this war. Now, of course, there is a political dimension to this. It is changing the character of the cemeteries as well. Some will say it's another step by Ukraine to try to extinguish its Soviet past. I suspect that is right, but it is nonetheless, and in spite of that, still a grisly detail. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. In the Bakhmut area, things are not going well for Ukraine. And of course, they're not going well for Ukraine elsewhere either. Ukraine is now firmly on the defensive in the north around Kupiansk. We've had a brief report from the Russian TASS news agency, or to be more precise, from Sergei Zybinsky, who is the spokesman for the Zapad battle group of the Russian armed forces, which is the force that is pushing towards Kupiansk. The center group, slightly to the south, is the one commanded by General Medvedev, which is pushing towards the Oskol River. So these are the Zapad and central groups that are engaging in this Russian northern offensive. This is a report from the spokesman of the Zapad battle group. And TASS reports him as saying, during the battles in the Kupiansk direction, assault groups of the 6th Combined Arms Army, that's of the Russian military, have seized two strongholds, 3 observation posts, and defeated an infantry platoon near the settlement of Olshana. And he then went on to say that the Ukrainian military attempted 2 counterattacks by units of the 41st Separate Mechanized and 95th Separate Airborne Brigades on Russian positions near the settlement of Sinkovka and the Mankovka natural area in order to regain lost positions. All counterattacks were successfully repulsed by the Russian military. Ukrainian losses amounted to a platoon of manpower. And then he then goes on to say, in addition, Russian heavy flamethrower systems, these are these terrifying TOS-1 systems, delivered a strike against a stronghold of the Ukrainian Army's 14th Separate Mechanized Brigade near the settlement of Sinkovka. A reconnaissance and assault squad wiped out a Polish-made Krab self-propelled gun with a Lancet loitering drone in the Shevstov Yar area and in the defense line of the battle group's 1st Tank Army, Ukrainian, that's the Russian army, enemy assault groups, in other words, Ukrainian troops from the 32nd and 44th Separate Mechanized Brigades carried out 2 attacks on Russian troops near the settlement of Novosyolovskaya. This was captured by the Russians about a week ago. The battle group, that's the Zapad battle group's artillery, inflicted damage on the enemy, eliminating a platoon of adversary manpower. So the overall picture continues to be of the Russians sturdily gaining traction around Kupiansk, gaining more positions there, preparing to storm first Sinkovka and then Kupiansk as well, and making significant inroads towards the Ukrainian forces in this particular area. Now, I gather that there's also been fighting in the Marinka area. I discussed that yesterday. This endless battle that's been fought for this small place near Donetsk city, which has been ongoing since October. The Ukrainians continue to cling on to a few stretches of buildings on the western outskirts. They've apparently established quite elaborate fortifications in this area. All Russian attempts to push them out up to this point have been unsuccessful. There's also been Ukrainian attacks in the Vuhledar area. The Ukrainian attacks in the Vuhledar area are, in my opinion, very much connected to Ukraine's ongoing current offensive, but apparently these attacks also have been unsuccessful, and there's been no real news at all about what's been going on near Avdiivka, this town near Donetsk city, where much of Ukraine's forces around Donetsk city is located, where the shelling of Donetsk city, which the Russians, by the way, now say is increasingly being conducted with cluster munitions. This is where a lot of that shelling takes place from. But anyway, there doesn't seem to have been much in the way of news about what is going on there. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. Russian advances, continuing to make advances in the Kupiansk area. This is now a gradually developing offensive. In the Bakmut area, the Russians pushing the Ukrainians back. One gets the sense that after 3 months of fighting, because the Ukrainian offensive or counterattacks in the Bakmut area began in the beginning of May, before the major offensive began to form on the 4th of June. After all this intense fighting, one gets the sense that Ukrainian forces in the Bakmut area have now become heavily run down, and that the offensive there is starting to lose momentum. Intense fighting on the Vremevka salient area, bitter fights for a single village, apparently still unresolved, and continuing debacle for Ukraine north of Rabotino Rabotino, Ukrainian forces trying to attack towards Rabotino from Orekhov, but not making any progress at all, or at least no significant progress that I can see. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. There was something else that took place yesterday in terms of the war, which is that Ukraine attempted to launch more attacks towards the Kerch bridge. And interestingly, it attempted to do it again with converted S-200 air defense missiles, which Ukraine has converted into ground attack missiles. These are high supersonic missiles, by the way. They can operate at pretty high speeds. They've been launched towards the Kerch bridge. Apparently there were also drone attacks towards the Kerch bridge as well. There was lots of pictures that appeared in the media, especially in the West, by the way, showing that the Russians had released white smoke around the Kerch bridge to make it more difficult, presumably for the drone operators to keep track of what their drones were supposed to be doing. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that all of these attacks on the Kerch bridge failed. Now, no doubt we will be seeing more attacks towards the Kerch bridge before very long, and I read a report that what Ukraine intends to do with these Taurus missiles that is going to be provided by Germany, foregone conclusion in my opinion, is that they're going to try to use these missiles to attack the Kerch bridge. The Storm Shadows have failed, so they're going to try with the Taurus missiles, which have longer range. Instead, whether they will succeed or not is another matter. But putting all that aside, and what might happen to the Kerch bridge eventually, it was very interesting to read some of the commentaries about what was going on in the Kerch bridge area. And I noticed an article that covered this attack, which appeared in the Guardian newspaper. And it spoke, the title of the article is Ukraine Strikes Kerch Bridge Connecting Crimea to Russia. That is a misleading article because the Russians say that a single missile and not a single drone actually hit the Kerch bridge. Now, you could argue that as a matter of syntax, and this article is not factually wrong, but I would say that, well, if you wanted to say Ukraine strikes or launches strikes towards the Kerch bridge, that would be correct. But certainly a title like Ukraine strikes Kerch bridge would cause a casual reader to think that the bridge had actually been hit when it's quite clear that it had not been hit. And I would say that a friend of mine who not only read the title, but read the article in its, read the article through, also came away with the impression, not just from the title, but from the way in which the article itself was phrased, that the Kerch bridge had actually been hit. In fact, if you read the article carefully, it doesn't say that. Now, I think that this kind of convoluted language intended to convey the impression that one thing has happened without actually saying so is, frankly, well, I don't think it's proper journalism. That's all I'm going to say. Anyway, we'll see what Ukraine tries to do with the Kerch Bridge, but it's clearly become a major fixation for Ukraine. As the Russians have pointed out, now that they control the land, now that they have a land bridge towards Crimea, they're sending supplies to their forces in Zaporozhye and in Kherson region along the land bridge. They're not actually sending supplies via the Kerch Bridge anymore, and I think that is true. So perhaps not quite as significant a target in military terms as Ukraine is trying to imply, but nonetheless, an important symbolic target, and one which Ukraine is apparently very, very keen to cause damage to. As I've discussed many times, inflicting damage on a bridge, significant damage that could really destroy a bridge, especially a bridge of this kind, is far from simple. The Ukrainians can do damage, but so far they haven't succeeded in causing the bridge damage that would affect its structural integrity, but that doesn't seem to be deterring them from trying, even though I suspect that the Russian defences are starting to harden in this area too. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about these missile and drone strikes. I mean, it's interesting that they're still continuing, but I have to say that I was generally put out by that article in The Guardian, which, to my mind, as I said, gives a misleading picture of what happened. Anyway, there we go. That's the situation in terms of the war. I am going to now go to Khodorkovsky's piece, and he has discussed the state of the fighting in some detail, and this is what he says. This is his general summary of the current state of the offensive. Now, again, I should stress I'm taking this from Slavyangrad. Khodorkovsky writes in Russian. They provided a translation. I suspect it's a machine translation which has been edited in places. But anyway, the gist of it is pretty clear. So this is what Khodorkovsky has written. Teplinsky, and Teplinsky, by the way, is a top Russian general, commander of Russia's airborne forces, its paratroop forces, who have played a huge role in this war. And Teplinsky is one of the most popular and widely respected commanders on the Russian side in this war. Anyway, Khodorkovsky says the following. Teplinsky was correct in saying that you can't win through defense alone. However, we had used up a significant portion of our resources during the initial phase of the special military operation. He's referring now to the fighting between February and June, early July 2022. And we required a pause to gather and prepare new resources. Some were impatient for results, and this led to deploying untrained reserves for an attack. I'm not quite sure what he's referring to there, but anyway. But then he goes on to say, against expectations, but rather predictably, the desired results didn't materialize. It could be a reference to the fighting near Vuhledar, which took place in the autumn of last year, though some of the troops who were involved in that fighting and who captured the village of Pavlivka were certainly highly trained troops, Russian troops, from one of Russia's Marine brigades, its Pacific Brigade, the Pacific Brigade of Russia's Marine Force. But to the best of my recollection, That was the only offensive that the Russians were conducting during that area. But anyway, who's to say what he's referring to here? But anyway, this goes on to say, furthermore, this approach failed to build a potential, capable of addressing substantial challenges. A situation arose where we had to transition into a deep echeloned defense, temporarily yielding initiative to the enemy, and he's now referring to the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives, where the Russians pulled back from territory that they had previously captured, temporarily yielding initiative to the enemy to buy time and exhaust their forces. And then he goes on to say, the army, he means the Russian army, receives reinforcements daily, and factories produce new equipment and weapons to replace losses. Admittedly, the consumption during the initial months was immense. There were accounts of certain commanders launching calibers as if from slingshots, but this practice has ceased. So the Russians are more careful now about how they fire their ammunition and use their resources. And then he goes on to say, presently the situation is gradually and steadily shifting in our favor. The enemy anticipated a retreat similar to what happened in Kharkiv and Kherson, yet we tenaciously resisted, preventing an immediate breakthrough of our defense and forcing them into a creeping offensive. Currently, a sense of mild panic prevails amongst them, prompting efforts to boost the armies and society's morale with minor victories. And we've seen that happen now with the very perhaps excessive comments that Ukraine made over the purported capture of Staromayorsk about 2 weeks ago, and perhaps we can expect the same thing with Zhaynaya over the next few days if the Russians do indeed pull out from that village. But anyway, and then Khodorkovsky finishes, nonetheless, mathematics remains an accurate and impartial science. So he takes the view that gradually, steadily, methodically, the balance of advantage is shifting in Russia's favor. That's from Khodorkovsky. And that seems to me the best overall summary of the situation. Ukraine is trying to continue with this offensive. It probably only has a few weeks left. The part of the offensive that was launched towards Bakmut seems to be running out of momentum. The part of the offensive, perhaps the most important part of the offensive, which was the part of the offensive launched from south of Orekhov towards Rabotino, that basically hasn't so far got off the ground at all. Exceptionally heavy losses in equipment and troops in this area have failed to make any kind of progress at all. There's been intense fighting on the Vremevka ledge. A couple of villages have been captured there. A difficult place anyway, as the Russians have pointed out, very difficult place to defend. By the way, on the specific topic of Zhaynaya, I remember reading about a week and a half ago that the Russians would probably withdraw from this village after a week and a half of fighting. That might be what we're going to see now. But as I said, I doubt it is of any great tactical significance. But anyway, Ukraine has been wasting its forces on this offensive. We don't have accurate or fully reliable figures for Ukrainian losses. We are getting some really grisly details about the numbers of Ukrainian amputations, about bodies being exhumed from Ukrainian cemeteries to replace them with the soldiers who have just died. I've seen one report which speaks of Bradley infantry fighting vehicle losses on the Ukrainian side being somewhere in the region of 40 to 50, which I suspect might be a bit right. It's higher, by the way, than what the Russians are claiming, but it came from a Ukrainian source. Overall, the Russians are fighting an attrition war successfully. And this is the view that the US media is now increasingly articulating it. We've seen that in The Hill, the New York Times to some extent, the Washington Post, other places as well, in the US media also. I would say that the British media, British still perhaps the most committed of all to continuing this war, to supporting Ukraine. They've there you still get odd articles which assure us that all is going well. There's been a very curious article by Mark Galeotti, who, by the way, I remember once upon a time as a commentator and analyst on Russian affairs, whom I took very, very seriously. It seems to me that as the years have passed, he's become increasingly hostile to President Putin and his government, and that has gradually caused him to adopt more and more of what I would call the official Western line on Russia and certainly on the war in Ukraine. And I'm afraid I think this is distorting his judgment and analysis. But anyway, we've had an article by him today in the London Times. Ukraine is winning the war with Russia, but it won't be over by Christmas. The talk about it being over by Christmas is, of course, an allusion to claims that were made during the First World War, at the start of the First World War, famously, that the war would be over by Christmas 1914, which of course it wasn't. But anyway, he goes on to say Western weapons means the Russians are outgunned and Putin is dithering, but Zelensky's counteroffensive remains grindingly slow. Now, there is an enormous amount of, I think, to be honest, cherry picking here. For example, he doesn't mention things like the numbers of amputations in Ukraine, or he doesn't really talk about the losses in Leopard 2s and Bradleys and all of that kind of thing. He doesn't really discuss much of that, but the basic line, which is very much the British line, and it must originate with the Ministry of Defence, is that difficult as things are for Ukraine, the Russians are even more overextended and overstretched. They have no available reserves. And eventually, it may take a long time. The offensive is progressing far more slowly than had been expected. Galeotti acknowledges that. But eventually, at some point, the breakthrough will take place. And he is talking in this article about the current offensive, preparing the ground for the next offensive, the great Ukrainian victory, which he now thinks is going to happen perhaps in the summer of next year, summer 2024, when the F-16s supposedly arrive on the scene. I have to say that this is, to my mind, well, I'm going to say it, I'm going to be polite, completely unrealistic commentary. I think the idea that Ukraine has Russia outgunned is flatly contradicted by the facts on the ground, and we could see anyway the results on the battlefield, and they are what they are. If I have to be frank, Mark Galeotti has fallen into the trap that it's always a temptation to do. He's taken a strong position in favour of Ukraine. He's been talking for months now about Russia's failure, Ukraine's success in the war. When the tables are turning, he is retreating into denialism. And I'm afraid this is what this article, to my mind, amounts to. And I think that the counsel that he's giving, the advice that the war should be continued through the autumn, the winter, the spring, the summer, that there should be, in effect, war without end in the hope of some elusive victory, because the Russian economy has been showing signs of overheating. By the way, on this issue, the Russian central bank has issued some more predictions about the overall situation in Russia. There's been, as I discussed recently, some actual falls in inflation rates in Russia in the last 2 weeks or so. Not unusual for that to happen, by the way, in August. But the idea that the entire Russian economy is running out of steam, and again, I think that Mark Galeotti is picking at straws, or cherry picking, if you like. He's not really looking at the whole picture. He's not looking at the military picture sensibly. He talks, as I said, about the Russian economy overheating. He disregards the steps that the Russian government and the central bank have already taken to bring all of that under control, and the statements from Russian officials which suggest that they are confident that they have managed and are going to continue to manage to bring it under control. Anyway, there we go. I would say this is denialism. If you want realism, if you want advice that can be more practically followed and which is much more pertinent to the current situation, then I would suggest that the correct article to go to is the article which appeared about 2 weeks ago in Time magazine by George Beebe and Jim Webb, advising that Ukraine abandon its offensive, withdraw, cede some ground, like the Russians did last year, build strong defenses, and then open negotiations, in which it will obviously have to make concessions, but that is the only practical way forward. Galeotti, by the way, basically rules negotiations out. Anyway, that's where we are, or so it seems to me, today in the war. My own sense is that the political problems of the administration in Washington are now intensifying. I've been seeing more commentaries coming out of the United States. There's much criticism from various sources about the appointment of Mr. Weiss, a special counsel, to investigate the Hunter Biden scandal. I can understand that criticism. I hold to my view that if the intention of appointing Mr. Weiss to that position is to trying to keep the investigation under some kind of control, under the Justice Department's control, I think that is going to fail. I think the mere fact that special counsel has been appointed now essentially confirms the seriousness of this affair. And I think that the administration, before very long, is going to slide towards a major legal and political crisis. And I've noticed, by the way, that even places like the Babylon Bee are starting to heap ridicule on the administration's defences, but also the defences of the president made by some of his Democratic Party supporters and the media. And it seems to me that when that starts to happen, then you can be sure that the problems are getting greater rather than lesser. And I'm going to also say that the president himself is in an extremely difficult position now. If the offensive fails, as there's clear expectation in Washington now that it will, if the offensive fails, if the war goes wrong, then he is going to be caught in the crossfire. He's going to be criticised both by those who think that he overinvested too much of the prestige of the United States in this war in Ukraine, and he will also be criticised by those who say that he supposedly didn't do enough to support Ukraine in this crisis. And he's at serious risk of being, as I said, caught in the crossfire, criticised by all sides, and perhaps becoming, dare I say, a scapegoat if another debacle, foreign policy debacle, appears to be looming over the horizon. And for all I know, the recent interest in the Hunter Biden case might to some extent be connected to that. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, the situation about the conflict over Ukraine today. No doubt there'll be more developments before very long, and obviously I will be tracking them. But in the meantime, the rest of the world remains engaged in lots of other problems. We have the BRICS summit, for example, looming over the horizon. It's now well in sight. There's been more discussions, by the way, between the Russians and the South Africans. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, as I understand, had more discussions with President Putin in preparation for this BRICS summit. We'll see what comes of it. Apparently up to 60 states, 60, are now intending to send representatives to the BRICS summit. And that is a very large number of states attending the BRICS summit. Bear in mind that BRICS is a grouping of just 5 states. So, we're looking at a very large meeting, a very big meeting indeed. And there's increasing talk that the BRICS is going to form itself into a group in some ways analogous to, and in other ways in rivalry to, the G7 group of the Western states. So that is now starting to approach us over the horizon. But there is, of course, another event which is perhaps even more critically active, and that is the event that we're seeing develop in West Africa. And there's supposed to be a meeting of ECOWAS. There was supposed to be a meeting of ECOWAS military chiefs yesterday in preparation for what was clearly indicated to be an imminent military intervention in Niger. The latest reports say that that meeting has been postponed indefinitely, and apparently there are now growing divisions within the ECOWAS states about what to do. There's opposition in Nigeria, there's opposition in Ghana, there's no consensus about how to move forward, and again, it's starting to look as if the possibility, the risk of a military intervention in Niger might be receding. I should say that I think this situation is unresolved. It will probably not become fully clear until before the end of this month what exactly is going to happen in Niger. If by the end of August the coup authorities are still in control of the country, they are, by the way, in the process of forming an actual government, but if they're still in control of the country by the end of August, then it is likely that they will remain so, and the prospects of an intervention will begin to fade away. I notice that more and more countries are now speaking out against an intervention. Chad, I understand, is another one. So clearly there's a split amongst the West African states. We will see where this goes. Now, again, let me repeat a point I've made before. The Russians are not involved in these events in West Africa. They did not instigate the coup in Niger. They do not support the coup in Niger. But if by the end of the year, say, the coup regime in Niger is still in control of the country, then it will have started to acquire an appearance of permanence and solidity. If at that point it turns to the Wagner organization for help, then I think we might start to see Wagner operatives appear there, and we might also see the Russians themselves taking a more active interest in Niger. But that is not the situation at the moment, and I think that the Russians will tread very carefully in Niger. They will not want to become overcommitted in Niger. They'll be very, very careful about what they do, and they'll be extremely careful in advance of any steps they do take in Niger to discuss them with the various other African states, including Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal. So that's the situation there. It's an evolving situation. Niger remains under intense economic pressure. It's not receiving free electricity from Nigeria any longer. It's now the target of an array of Western sanctions. I wonder how sustainable that position is going to be. I would not be surprised if at some point over the next few months or years, all of the sanctions and all of that are quietly put aside, because Niger remains important, and I think there might be a decision at some point, even on the part of Western governments, that it's better to work with the authority in Niger rather than against it. But at the moment, the situation continues to be tense, and I still think that the possibility of an intervention in Niger, well, it's too early to completely rule that out. Anyway, that's the situation today, as of this morning, on the 13th of August. It's possible that more will happen over the course of the day. It's quite possible, for example, that the Russians will indeed, over the course of today, finally withdraw from Urajnaye. We'll see. But anyway, there could be more events in the north, more advances by the Russian army towards Kupiansk. There could be more fighting in the Bakmut area. It's quite likely there'll be more Ukrainian attacks towards Rabotino. There may be more Ukrainian drone and missile strikes. There's very likely to be more Russian drone and missile strikes. As I said, much could easily happen over the course of the next 24 hours. But if so, I will have to discuss it in my follow-up video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that all our programs can be found on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Also, don't forget to check out our shop, get yourself our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, more from me soon, and have a very good day.